Okay, so the last video was over 40 minutes, and I think it was 40 minutes well spent because this is important stuff. But I also want to be very sensitive with your time, so I want to make sure that I don't go over that, especially considering that you're submitting things on Blackboard, etc. as part of your class time. On that note, I should also say, remember to, just like we did last time, make number one any questions you have. So questions about writing reflections, questions about APA, any questions about what we're about to discuss. Those can go as number one, which by my count makes us, we're now at 5 because we have the 2, 3, and 4 as those citations that you're testing out. Okay. Really, what we're talking about now is development. And it's a really interesting question. When you stop and think about it, if you look at a baby, if you spend a lot of time with a baby, you realize what ridiculous little creatures they are. I mean, you look at them and they look back at you and there doesn't seem to be much really thinking there. It doesn't seem to be. Just seems to be this slobbering little creature that will crawl off of a house if you let the creature. It just seems to be a motor with nothing actually running that motor. So how do we go from something like this to an adult? At some point, Albert Einstein was one of these ridiculous babbling little babies, and there was somebody condescendingly talking to Albert Einstein, "Who's a good little baby?" And somehow that baby turned into Albert Einstein. In this case, this baby's not me. I wasn't born in black and white photography days. This is Steve Jobs. So here's the question. How did we go from silly little baby to Steve Jobs? Was all that Steve Jobby stuff somehow already inside the baby, just waiting to blossom like a flower? Or was it just the environment that played on Steve Jobs? Was it just that Steve Jobs had a really unique environment, and that's what made Steve Jobs who he was? Annoyingly, according to Ashton Kutcher, the Leonardo da Vinci of our time. Where did that come from? One of the first developmental theories that we can place is Plato's idea, and it's ultimately really a developmental theory, but it's a theory about levels of the soul. And he says at the base level we have the appetites, these desires, and this is how he describes it. It says, it fills us full of love and lusts and fears and fancies of all kinds and endless foolery and takes away the power of thinking at all. For those of you who've studied Freud, this is really the same thing as the concept of the id. And really, the idea of the ego and the superego play along these same lines. He says the next level is the spirit. Spirit is what controls the appetites. It's courage, conviction, temperance, fierceness, aggressive, self-assertion, ambition. So, what is courage? Courage is not absence of fear, right? Courage is control of fear. So he says all animals have this. We have the appetites, the spirit, but there's one level that is uniquely human, and that's this outer layer. This is the layer of reason. Knowing when to be courageous. Knowing when to run. Right? And he says this is the eternal level. This is the uniquely human level. This leads into an educational theory, one of the earliest educational theories. He says from years 1 to 3, an infant should be free from fear and pain. Years 3 to 6, introduce sports, social contact. Years 6 to 18, divide the sexes, keep them away from each other. We start off with music and gymnastics, then we get into more specialized things, mathematical, scientific studies. And he says children should be guided to participate in activities aligned with their natural abilities. Something he was not afraid to say. There's some people who just are more capable than others. Now, if you look at this, you'll realize a lot of this stuff is pretty consistent with how we do things today. For the most part, we just try to keep infants free from fear, free from pain. Years 3 to 6, this is preschool, right? And really one of the big points of preschool is social contact with peers. Years 6 to 18, division of sexes. In a lot of private schools this happens. There have been movements in the public schools to divide the sexes, and we're going to be talking about that later. The idea that we get into more specific mathematical scientific studies as kids get older, yes. And this last thing, children should be guided to participate in activities aligned with their natural abilities. This is something that's actually pretty consistent with how we do things in the United States, and not necessarily other countries, which is the idea that when we're very young, some of you maybe in first grade, were placed into little ability groups. Oh, this kid is a blue robin, and this one is a gray turtle dove. And the teacher just, I guess, assumed you didn't know which was which. The reading groups, the math groups. And then once you got into high school, there were things like the, vocational track, the college preparatory track, the honors track, etc. So, we see a lot of this in education today, and particularly in education in the United States. This is another thing. I really want to know what you think about this. And so you can make this number 5 for you. He says, the censorship of the writers of fiction is necessary because anything that the child receives into his mind, and a lot of these things, a lot of these older texts, we're going to see a lot of sexist language, into his mind is likely to become indelible and unalterable. And therefore, the talks which the young first hear should be models of virtuous thoughts. What do you think about this? What do you think about censorship? Do you think that an 11-year-old should be able to walk into a rated R movie? A 9-year-old? Why? Why not? Is there a certain time when a kid is ready? At 17, are you magically ready to be able to handle a rated R movie? Something click. Something different. Is something different between an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, that they can somehow bring context into this and watch rated R movies, but understand what the intention is and not to take things so literally. Listen to, music that has explicit content and be able to handle that. And while you're on that, think about this too, because this is what Plato thought about adolescence and alcohol. He says, fire must not be poured on fire. Adolescents should not have alcohol. They're crazy as it is. What do you think about having a drinking age of 21? A 20-year-old is just not ready yet to be able to handle the power of alcohol. But by 21, you suddenly realize, wait, there's certain context in which I should drink. There's certain amounts which I should drink. You just have more reason. That's what it comes back down to, right? Can suddenly put things into place, control the appetites, and control how the appetites are controlled. So that's one way of looking at development. In the Middle Ages, we saw kind of a different view of how people develop. This is a picture, and this is actually very common in paintings there. Painting of the Mother Mary and the baby Jesus. Take a good look at this. See if you notice anything funny about this. Look at baby Jesus particularly. Notice anything strange? Do you notice that the baby Jesus is like a little man? Look at how he's dressed. He's got a little book, so he's a literate baby. His head. Look at the size of his head. It's also no idea like cephalocaudal development. Like the children's heads are huge. And again, this is really common in paintings of the time. Because development was viewed as something that was much more gradual, right? As something that, had steps. There's qualitatively different points in a child's life. Well, how does this all begin, though? At some point, we just started off as a sperm cell. Well, they had that figured out, too. This is truly a scientific drawing of a sperm cell in 1694. The idea being that, there's like this little man that was hidden in the sperm cell, and the little man just jumps out. That's the homunculus. That's the idea of the homunculus. Well, how does that affect what we do with education and how we interact with children? If we think that the difference between an adult and a child is something that's a very quantitative, very gradual thing, as opposed to qualitative differences, they just think differently. Then children should really have the same interest in the values. In the Middle Ages, for the most part, they didn't hide these things from kids. They didn't hide sex from kids. or violence, really. They included them in the games, the activities they would do. But it also meant that you had expectations for behavior. When Sophia, my daughter, my 6-year-old, almost 6-year-old, makes a mistake, a lot of times I realize that she didn't do it because she was trying to be this horrible, immoral person, but because she just didn't get it, really. And that's not how they approach things typically in the Middle Ages. Now, it was that you got it and you'd done something bad, and so we had to kind of beat the devil out of you, right? And that's where we get the harsh discipline from. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says this, and I think it's very true, that childhood has its own way of seeing, thinking, and feeling, and nothing is more foolish than to try to substitute ours for them. So this is the first big question in development. Is development something that's continuous, or is it something that's discontinuous? The Middle Ages is this very gradual thing as opposed to occurring more or less kind of in steps. You're kind of a different person and you think in different ways, etc., at different time points. Our second question is a very different one. And we'll start with John Locke and the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank tablet or the blank slate. And really he's unfairly credited for this, but along with the other British empiricists, he put a lot of emphasis on experience. So I'm going to go ahead and misquote him like everybody misquotes him by saying, let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper void of all characters without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? To this I answer in one word, from experience. Why Steve Jobs? Because of the experiences he had. This is different than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really focused on the idea of the noble savage, the idea that if we just leave people alone to their own devices, they'll be fine. It's really civilization that destroys things. He says everything is good as it comes from the hands of the Creator. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. So in Emile, in his book, he has a book about education. It's fascinating. For the first few years, kids literally are just supposed to run around in a field and, whatever happens. If they fall and they get hurt, then they learn from that on their own. But the idea is that it's a very hands-off approach. Now, we see hands-off approaches in some modern educational philosophies, but we'll keep moving on. Here's a question. Are children innately good? Are children just born good? Matt Stone from South Park certainly doesn't think so. He says, parents who disapprove of South Park have an idyllic version of what kids are like. Kids don't have any kind of tact or social etiquette. They're just complete little raging bastards. Well, is that true? Are kids just born one way, born another way? Or are they born like a blank slate? They're neither good nor bad. And then if that's true, is everything that makes them good or bad from the environment? And therefore, are they actually intrinsically good or bad? Or is it just a reflection of what they've been through? So here's the second major question. Are human development, knowledge, and behavior predominantly the result of nature or nurture? And here we're using nurture not just in terms of parenting, but in a broader sense. There are other words that we could use here. Genetic factors versus environmental factors. Things that are endogenous versus things that are exogenous. This is an important ultrasound to me. This is my little daughter. When she was a little tiny baby, you can barely make out where she is in this ultrasound. When you're at this stage as a parent, everybody's asking all sorts of nature questions. Who's the baby going to look like? Is the baby going to be a boy or a girl? That's always a huge one, right? Is this person going to be a mathematician? Is this person going to be a scientist? Is he or she going to be active or chill out all the time? All these nature-based questions. But the second that baby is born, everybody freaks out about the nurture element, and really the nature really doesn't even come into it. Oh my gosh, the baby's crib. I think the baby's crib is supposed to have red and black on it, or shiny things. I've heard that that stimulates the baby's mind. Oh, and we have to play Mozart for the baby at all times. If we don't, the baby's mind will not be stimulated. The baby will not grow up to be wonderful. We have to make sure everything is just right. And if the baby's a boy, we have to make it, things in blue. If the baby's a girl, then we absolutely have to have a pink area for the baby to be in, etc. People have debated these things for a long time. Socrates says, all inquiry and all learning is but recollection. We're just recalling things. We have these innate ideas. We're just recalling things that we knew at some point. Lenin, on the other side, says, give me a child until the age of 7. I'll give you back a communist for life. That's very similar to what, the father of American behaviorism says. John Watson says, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. This is one of my favorite quotes. If you haven't read The Kite Runner, I strongly recommend it. Children are not coloring books that you can color any way you want. Alexander Pope, just as the twig is bent, the tree's inclined. And then we have Steven Pinker, who you read. The hereditability of intelligence increases over the lifespan and can be as high as 0.8 later in life. 0.8. Highly correlated. Forget as the twig is bent and think, oh my God, I'm turning into my parents. Well, let's talk about those things. But first, I'm going to give you 4 cases. And this is the first case.
Okay. Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
Okay, so that was pretty painful. So why don't you write as your next point? Why would you guess Caitlin has such trouble answering this question? Take a minute to answer that. Okay, let's look at another situation. Kenneth Wayne Jennings III holds the record for the longest winning streak on the U.S. syndicated game show Jeopardy. His earnings on the show were $3,172,700. Why would you guess Ken answers trivia questions with ease? Again, make that another point. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Before she died, Mother Teresa had founded and personally worked within hundreds of orphanages, schools, soup kitchens, family counseling programs, and homes for people living with HIV, AIDS, leprosy, and tuberculosis. Why would you guess Mother Teresa did such things? Okay, next one. On April 15th, 2013, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his older brother reportedly detonated homemade bombs at the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and wounding over 200 more. Shortly thereafter, he and his brother allegedly killed an MIT police officer, carjacked an SUV, and fired at police officers. What would you guess led Dzhokhar to do such a thing? Okay, I'm going to assume that if you had any if you're still writing, you paused by now. But looking back over your 4 answers, when they were good things, right, like Ken Jennings or Mother Teresa, and you look back at your answers, did you have things that were kind of related to their nature? Ken Jennings was just, he's brilliant. Maybe he has a, wonderful working memory. Mother Teresa, she's just a good person. She has a really good heart. As opposed to nurture. So when Miss South Carolina just stumbles over this question, is it just because of her terrible education, etc.? Really, and if you look at that question, it's actually really, she looks ridiculous, but it's a difficult question. They're asking her why Americans can't place something on a map. Well, she has to answer this not as she truly feels, but on something that's politically safe, for somebody that's running for Miss Teen USA. Right? She has to be, she has to talk about puppy dogs and rainbows and wonderful things and somehow put a positive spin on this. And it's very difficult to do that. With Jakar, after this happened, as with, the Columbine shooters, a lot of times it comes down again to, okay, the nurture must have been the problem. The environment must have been the problem. This is somebody who became a monster. When in both these cases, a lot of people have gone back, forensic psychologists have said, no, there's something that was going on psychologically. With, for instance, Eric from the Columbine shooting, they're pretty sure he was dealing with psychopathy, which we don't believe is an environmental thing.